On August 14, 1827, the body of a plantation owner named Josiah Crane was discovered in his library, within the rice fields surrounding Charleston, South Carolina. His skull had been so utterly demolished that physicians examining the corpse noted bone fragments embedded in a mahogany desk a full 6 feet away. The coroner's report, which remains preserved in the Charleston County Archives to this day, detailed wounds consistent with compression inflicted by hands of remarkable size and power, exceeding what is normally considered humanly possible. The sole suspect was a woman, standing 6 feet 8 inches tall and weighing more than 240 pounds of solid muscle, who melted into the August night and was never seen again. For close to 2 centuries now, local historians have been locked in debate over whether Sarah Drummond was an actual person or merely a legend conjured from guilt and fear. However, the medical records, the bills of sale, and the eyewitness accounts all point toward something far more unsettling, that she was indeed real, and that the events inside that library were the inescapable outcome of a horror that had been festering for years. Before we proceed further into the account of Sarah Drummond and that evening which sent Charleston society into a hush lasting generations, allow me to ask you something. If you have a passion for authentic historical enigmas that walk the line between documented reality and spine-tingling folklore, please hit that subscribe button right now. Also, leave a comment telling me which state or city you are listening from. I personally read each and every one, and it genuinely brings me joy to know these overlooked American tales are reaching people across the nation. Now, let's go back to where this nightmare had its true genesis. The tale of Sarah Drummond does not commence with violence. It begins with currency. In the spring of 1823, the port of Charleston was experiencing one of its most frenzied trading seasons in decades. Ships were arriving weekly from the Caribbean, from West Africa, from the tobacco regions of Virginia, all of them carrying human cargo destined for the markets on Chalmers Street and at Gadsden's Wharf. Charleston wasn't merely a port city. It stood as the pulsing center of the domestic slave trade in the American South, a place where fortunes were amassed through the purchase and sale of human beings with the same routine efficiency as bales of cotton or barrels of rice. The rice estates surrounding Charleston were particularly gruesome operations. Unlike the cotton fields found further inland, cultivating rice demanded that workers stand for hours on end in swamps filled with malaria-carrying mosquitoes, poisonous snakes, and alligators. The mortality rate among the enslaved laborers on these rice estates was appalling. Some historical approximations suggest that close to 30% of enslaved individuals working the rice paddies died within their initial 12 months. The labor was so perilous, so utterly draining, so lethal that plantation proprietors were perpetually in need of buying new workers to fill the gaps left by those who had succumbed. This situation gave rise to a distorted economy. Slave traders combed the southern states searching for robust, healthy individuals capable of enduring the brutality of the rice swamps. And occasionally they came across something exceptional, something that would command an exorbitant price. In March of 1823, a slave trader by the name of Caleb Rutherford reached Charleston with a coffle of 37 individuals he had procured in Virginia and North Carolina. In their midst was a young woman, maybe 19 or 20 years old, who instantly attracted notice for one undeniable reason: she was immense. Records from the auction house at the time depict her as being nearly 7 feet in stature, possessing a build of unusual width and musculature. Onlookers at the sale reported that she was forced to stoop just to clear doorways, and that her hands were so vast they could completely envelop a man's head. Her name, according to the auction documentation, was Sarah. As was standard practice, no surname was entered in the original sales paperwork. She had come into the world on a modest farm in Piedmont, North Carolina, the child of an enslaved woman whose identity has been erased by history. From the few records that remain, it seems Sarah had a condition that modern medicine would identify as pituitary gigantism, an uncommon disorder resulting from an overabundance of growth hormone, generally caused by a non-cancerous tumor on the pituitary gland. However, in the 1820s, no such medical knowledge existed. To those who laid eyes on her, Sarah was merely a freak of nature, an oddity, and possibly a highly profitable one. The auction took place on a humid Tuesday morning late in March. The auction house on Chalmers Street was overflowing with planters, traders, and curious spectators who had caught wind of rumors about the giant woman. As Sarah was led onto the platform, still wearing shackles on her wrists and ankles, a murmur coursed through the throng. She loomed nearly a full head above the auctioneer, a stout man named James Vanderhorst who had conducted thousands of such sales, but who later confessed to acquaintances that he had never laid eyes on anything quite like her. The bidding kicked off at $400, already a considerable amount. Within minutes, it had escalated to $800, then to $1,000. Planters were yelling out their bids, each striving to surpass the other, seeing in Sarah not simply a laborer, but a spectacle, someone who could attract visitors, someone who could be put on show. The victorious bid came from a man positioned near the back of the room. His identity was Josiah Crane, and he parted with $1,300 for Sarah Drummond. That sum represented one of the most exorbitant prices ever documented for a single enslaved person at a Charleston auction during that year. Crane was a rice planter who held ownership of a medium-sized estate called Marsh Bend, positioned about 18 miles southwest of Charleston, deep within the labyrinth of tidal marshes and winding rivers that define the Lowcountry. He was 42, a widower, and held a reputation among fellow planters as someone who operated his plantation with a rigid grip, possessing little tolerance for what he termed softness in the handling of enslaved workers. As Sarah was escorted away from the auction block, her wrists now bound, with Crane's ownership mark seared into a leather collar encircling her neck, witnesses noted that she never uttered a sound. She did not weep. She did not put up any fight. She simply gazed straight ahead with dark, unreadable eyes, her massive form moving with an oddly tranquil elegance despite the restraints. No one present at that auction could have possibly grasped what they had just witnessed. They could not have foreseen that they were observing the start of a story destined to culminate in bloodshed, enigma, and a legend that would shadow the Lowcountry for generations. Yet perhaps they should have sensed something. Because, as the records indicate, just as Crane was leading Sarah toward his wagon for the trip to Marsh Bend, an elderly woman in the crowd, a free black woman who sold flowers near the market, was overheard saying, "That man just went and bought his own death." Marsh Bend Plantation embodied everything the Lowcountry was famous for, and everything that made it a living inferno for those compelled to labor there. The main residence was a two-story building constructed in the Georgian fashion, featuring white columns and a wide veranda that gazed out over the rice paddies extending toward the Ashley River. Behind this main house sat the kitchen building, the overseer's cottage, a barn, a rice mill, and a row of 12 slave cabins assembled from rough-hewn timber, boasting dirt floors and an absence of windows. Beyond these lay the fields, hundreds of acres of painstakingly engineered rice paddies connected by an intricate network of dikes, channels, and floodgates that regulated the tidal water flow crucial for rice farming. When Sarah arrived at Marsh Bend in late March of 1823, she was designated for cabin number 7, which she would end up sharing with 5 other women. The overseer, a lean, jumpy man by the name of Porter Grimble, appeared distinctly unsettled by her size. According to a letter he dispatched to his brother in Columbia, which still resides in the South Carolina Historical Society archives, he portrayed Sarah as a being of such unnatural proportions that she must stoop to get through the cabin door, and when she stands fully upright, she calls to mind some ancient colossus more than a Christian woman. However, Josiah Crane had not dished out $1,300 for Sarah simply to toil in the fields. He had other intentions. Within the initial week following her arrival, Crane started presenting Sarah to guests. He would extend invitations to neighboring planters, Charleston merchants, and even passing gentlemen to come to Marsh Bend specifically to view the giant, he had obtained. Sarah would be fetched to the main house, instructed to stand in the parlor or on the front veranda, and ordered to demonstrate her size and power. Crane would have her hoist heavy items, barrels packed with rice, iron anvils, even fully grown pigs. He would position himself next to her so visitors could appreciate the stark contrast in their heights. He would have her extend her hand so men could insert their own palms inside hers and gape at the difference. A diary entry from a Charleston physician named Dr. Edmund Porcher, who visited Marsh Bend in May of 1823, offers a chilling window into these exhibitions. Dr. Porcher wrote, "Mr. Crane has acquired a female specimen of most extraordinary proportions. She stands at least 6½ feet in height, perhaps more, with hands and feet of such dimension that I could scarcely credit my own measurements. Her strength appears commensurate with her size. I observed her lift a barrel of rice weighing no less than 300 pounds with apparent ease. Mr. Crane informs me he has received numerous offers to purchase her, but he declines, as she has become quite the attraction in our county. I confess the sight of her produced in me an unsettling sensation, as if nature herself had been experimenting with proportions beyond the normal boundaries of the human form. For Sarah, these showings were merely the commencement of her anguish at Marshbend. When she wasn't being put on display for Crane's guests, she was set to labor in the rice paddies under conditions that would have shattered most individuals within months. Rice farming in the South Carolina Lowcountry involved backbreaking, perilous work. Laborers would wade into the inundated fields before sunrise, standing in water up to their thighs for 10 to 12 hours at a time, hunched over beneath the scorching sun, planting, weeding, or collecting rice. The water was brackish, swarming with leeches and water moccasins. The air buzzed with clouds of mosquitoes. The heat was suffocating, exacerbated by the humidity rising from the marshes. Sarah's exceptional size rendered her both an advantage and a mark. She could transport loads that would demand 2 or 3 ordinary workers. She could operate the hefty wooden pestles used for threshing rice with a speed and force that amazed even the overseer. But her prominence also rendered her susceptible. When Crane desired to make an example, to demonstrate the consequences for those who worked too slowly or exhibited defiance, he would frequently select Sarah, not because she had committed any transgression, but because disciplining someone of her magnitude sent a message that nobody was beyond his grasp. The punishments were brutal. Historical records from rice estates document the employment of whipping posts, wooden stocks, and a device referred to as the buck, where an individual would be compelled to sit with their knees drawn up, a stick placed beneath their knees and over their arms, effectively rendering them immobile in an excruciating position for hours. Sarah underwent all of these. Overseer Grimble's correspondence mentions at least 3 instances during Sarah's initial year at Marshbend where she was publicly disciplined for insolence or for declining to be exhibited. But Sarah did not fracture, or at least, not in the manner Crane anticipated. According to accounts from other enslaved individuals at Marshbend, testimony that would only be collected years later under vastly different circumstances, Sarah evolved into someone the community both dreaded and depended upon. Her power was utilized for the most strenuous assignments, maneuvering the massive floodgates that regulated water influx into the rice fields, hauling timber for repairs, hoisting boats from the water. However, her presence also served a protective function. There were narratives of her stepping between an overseer's whip and a child too young to work, only to be beaten regardless. Accounts of her transporting workers who had collapsed from heat exhaustion back to their cabins. Tales of her standing mutely yet unyieldingly when Crane attempted to separate mothers from their offspring during sales to other estates. She seldom spoke. When she did, her voice was soft and unwavering, carrying an authority that seemed incongruous with her status as property. Some of the more seasoned enslaved individuals at Marshbend began referring to her as Tall Sarah or simply the Wall because once she resolved to stand somewhere, nothing could shift her except through force. And Josiah Crane was starting to understand that force by itself might prove insufficient. The initial significant confrontation between Crane and Sarah took place in the summer of 1824, approximately 15 months following her arrival at Marshbend. A Charleston gentleman named Augustus Peyton had gotten word about the giant enslaved woman and journeyed to Marshbend carrying an offer. He would pay Crane $300 to bring Sarah to Charleston for 2 weeks, to exhibit her at a traveling show he was arranging, featuring curiosities of nature and science. The exhibition would include preserved specimens, mechanical contraptions, and Sarah as the living centerpiece. Crane consented without hesitation. The opportunity to generate income while concurrently boosting his own standing in Charleston society proved too enticing to decline. He apprised Sarah of the arrangement, anticipating her usual compliance. However, this occasion was different. According to testimony from a house servant named Ruth, who was present during the conversation, Sarah fixed her gaze directly on Crane and uttered very quietly, "I will not go." Crane was taken aback. In the year and a half he had possessed Sarah, she had never directly disobeyed an order. He reiterated the command, his voice escalating. Sarah reiterated her refusal, her voice remaining steady and hushed. Crane's face turned crimson. He summoned the overseer. He commanded that Sarah be taken to the whipping post forthwith. What ensued next became the focus of intense conversation among the enslaved community at Marshbend and would be murmured about for years. For men, including Overseer Grimble, made an attempt to coerce Sarah toward the post. She didn't exactly fight them. She simply ceased moving. She planted her feet and became dead weight. The 4 men tugged, shoved, struck her with fists and a cane, but Sarah remained immovable. It required 8 men employing ropes and ultimately threatening to harm other enslaved people if she didn't acquiesce, before Sarah finally proceeded to the post. The punishment was severe, 30 lashes with a braided leather whip. Witnesses stated that Sarah emitted no noise during the flogging, even as blood soaked through the coarse cotton dress she wore. When it concluded, and she was eventually freed from the post, she ambled back to her cabin unassisted, her back lacerated, yet her posture as erect as ever. She did not go to Charleston. Crane, humiliated before his overseer and workers, ultimately informed Peyton the deal was off, fabricating an excuse about Sarah falling ill. However, something had altered at Marsh Bend. The other enslaved individuals had witnessed that Sarah could be hurt, yes. But they had also witnessed that she could compel Josiah Crane to retreat. That frightened Crane more than he was prepared to acknowledge. Over the ensuing year, a tense equilibrium developed. Crane continued to exhibit Sarah to visitors who came to Marsh Bend, but he ceased attempting to transport her off the plantation. Sarah persisted in working the fields with the same quiet, unyielding power. The punishments continued, but they grew less frequent, as if Crane understood that each one diminished his authority rather than reinforcing it. Yet beneath the facade of that daily grind, something else was germinating. Something that would come to a terrible climax on a sweltering August night in 1827 and alter everything. Because in the spring of 1826, Sarah became pregnant. The identity of the father of Sarah's child was never formally documented, but testimony from other enslaved individuals at Marsh Bend narrates a consistent story. His name was Marcus, a man around 30 years old who functioned as a carpenter on the estate, proficient in the intricate woodwork necessary for maintaining the rice mills and floodgate mechanisms. Marcus had arrived at Marsh Bend 2 years before Sarah, purchased from an estate sale in Georgetown. He was recognized as a quiet, contemplative man capable of fixing nearly anything, who had lost his own wife and daughter when they were sold away from him years earlier. The relationship between Marcus and Sarah was, by all accounts, born more from mutual respect than from passion. In a world where so much was confiscated from them, where their bodies and labor were possessed by another, they discovered in each other something resembling partnership. They would sit together in the evenings after the work was finished, speaking softly outside the cabins. Marcus would tell Sarah about the places he had seen, the things he had built. Sarah, who had been relocated so many times in her young life that she barely recalled her own mother's face, would listen. When Sarah realized she was pregnant in early 1826, the intelligence spread swiftly through the slave quarters. Pregnancy on a plantation was always fraught, symbolizing both hope and fresh horror. A child signified continuity, family, the prospect of something beyond the endless cycle of labor. But it also signified vulnerability. It meant another life that could be threatened, sold, exploited as leverage. And on an estate owned by someone like Josiah Crane, it signified danger. Sarah's pregnancy was arduous from the outset. Her size, the very attribute that had rendered her valuable to Crane, made carrying a child physically challenging. She continued laboring in the fields throughout her initial months of pregnancy, as all enslaved women were expected to do. However, the other women at Marsh Bend observed that she moved more slowly, that she would occasionally pause and press a hand to her lower back, her face betraying an unusual flicker of discomfort. Crane observed as well, but for divergent reasons. A pregnant enslaved woman signified, in his calculation, another piece of property, another individual he could own, sell, or utilize. He started talking openly about the child, informing visitors that he anticipated the infant would be of unusual size given the mother's exceptional dimensions, and conjecturing about what price such a child might command when old enough to sell. These comments, overheard by the house servants and relayed back to the quarters, filled Sarah with a cold dread she had never previously experienced. She had endured beatings, degradation, exhaustion, hunger. But the thought of her child being treated as Crane had treated her, displayed like an animal, punished for entertainment, perhaps eventually sold away, was something different, something unendurable. Marcus noticed the transformation in Sarah. She became even more silent than usual, her face hard, her eyes far away. At night, she would sit outside the cabin with her hands on her belly, gazing toward the main house with an expression that frightened even those who knew her intimately. In November of 1826, Sarah was instructed to cease field work and was given lighter duties around the plantation, shelling rice, mending, laboring in the kitchen garden. Her belly had grown enormous, making it difficult for her to move with her characteristic ease. But even in this reduced condition, she remained an imposing presence. The kitchen workers reported that when Sarah stood in the kitchen doorway, she entirely blocked out the sunlight. The birth occurred in late January of 1827, during one of the coldest nights of the winter. Sarah went into labor just past midnight, attended by two older enslaved women who served as midwives for the plantation community, a woman named Hester and another named Dinah. The labor was protracted and exceedingly difficult. Sarah, who had never cried out during beatings, screamed that night. The sound traveled across the frozen fields and reached the main house, where Crane was roused by the noise. According to his own later testimony, he lit a lantern and walked to the slave quarters, standing outside cabin number 7, listening to the sounds emanating from within. Just before daybreak, the baby was born. A boy. He was large for a newborn, nearly 11 pounds, but otherwise seemed healthy and normal. When the infant cried, Hester would later testify, Sarah wept for the first time anyone at Marsh Bend had ever witnessed. She cradled her son against her chest, examining his tiny hands, his face, whispering words no one else could discern. Marcus was permitted into the cabin shortly after the delivery. He stood next to Sarah, looking down at the child, and those present reported that something passed between them in that instant. Some unspoken comprehension or resolution. Sarah named her son Jacob. It was a biblical name common among enslaved people, carrying implications of struggle and endurance. For a few brief weeks, despite everything, something resembling happiness existed in cabin number 7. Sarah would nurse Jacob, hold him for hours, sing to him in a low voice that resonated like distant thunder. Marcus would carve small playthings for the baby, tiny wooden animals that he would place in the cradle he had constructed. But Josiah Crane was watching and biding his time. By the summer of 1827, Jacob was 6 months old. He was growing rapidly, already larger than most babies his age, and had begun to smile and grasp for objects with chubby hands. Sarah had resumed working, but lighter tasks than before, mostly around the plantation buildings. She kept Jacob with her whenever feasible, carrying him on her hip or back while she worked, never letting him out of her sight for long. Marcus had upgraded the cabin for them, utilizing scrap wood and his skills to enhance the structure, adding a proper door with a latch and a small window with shutters. It was still a slave cabin, still barely adequate shelter, but it was theirs. And within those rough walls, they endeavored to construct something approximating a family. However, in Charleston, Josiah Crane's financial situation was deteriorating. The rice market had been unstable for several years, and Crane had made some disastrous investments in a shipping venture that failed. He was indebted to multiple creditors, and they were growing increasingly insistent. By July of 1827, Crane confronted the genuine prospect of losing Marsh Bend entirely if he couldn't generate capital swiftly. The solution, in his mind, was straightforward: sell some of his enslaved laborers. He could dispose of 5 or 6 individuals and clear sufficient debt to stabilize his situation. The question was whom to sell. On a humid Tuesday afternoon in early August, a slave trader named Nathaniel Gadsden arrived at Marsh Bend. Gadsden was well known in the Charleston market, a man who specialized in purchasing enslaved people from financially distressed planters and then reselling them at auction or to plantation owners further south in Georgia and Florida. He had a reputation for striking hard bargains and for being indifferent to where families ended up after he purchased them. Crane and Gadsden spent several hours traversing the plantation, inspecting the enslaved laborers, discussing their ages, skills, and potential prices. When they reached the area near the kitchen garden where Sarah was working with Jacob dozing in a cloth sling on her back, Gadsden halted and stared. The conversation that ensued was overheard by a young boy named Peter who was supposed to be hauling water but had concealed himself behind a woodpile, close enough to hear. Peter's testimony, given many years later, furnishes the sole direct account of what was said. Gadsden, Lord Almighty, is that the giant woman I heard about? Crane, that is Sarah, 6'8", strongest worker I have. Gadsden, and the child? Crane, her son, about 6 months old. Gadsden moved closer, circling Sarah while she persisted in her labor, her face expressionless. He seemed especially intrigued by Jacob. Gadsden, how much for the child? Sarah's hands halted their motion. She didn't turn around, but her entire form became rigid. Crane, I hadn't considered selling him separately. Gadsden, I have a buyer in Savannah. Wealthy family looking for a house servant they can train from infancy. They pay premium prices for children. Light work. Good conditions. I could give you $400 for that baby today. A lengthy silence ensued. Sarah had gradually turned to face them now, still grasping her hoe, her face utterly blank. Crane, $400. Gadsden, today. Cash. I take him with me when I leave this afternoon. Peter reported that Sarah emitted a sound then, low in her throat, like an animal, but she didn't speak. Crane looked at her, then back at Gadsden. Crane, I need to consider this. But everyone who overheard that exchange understood the truth. Josiah Crane needed $400 more than he needed to retain a 6-month-old infant on his plantation. It was merely a question of time. That night in cabin number 7, Sarah and Marcus conversed in urgent whispers until well after dark. No one knows precisely what they said, but the conclusion they reached would reverberate through history. The following morning, August 13, 1827, Marcus was gone. He had vanished during the night, taking nothing with him except the clothes on his back. An enslaved man running away from a plantation wasn't unusual, though it was exceedingly dangerous. The roads were patrolled. Slave catchers operated throughout the Low Country with dogs and weapons. The punishment for captured runaways was barbaric. But Marcus hadn't fled alone, because concealed in the lining of his coat, sewn there by Sarah herself, was a detailed map Marcus had drawn of the plantation, the surrounding area, and the route to Charleston, along with a letter. The letter was addressed to anyone in Charleston who might provide assistance, explaining that Josiah Crane was planning to sell an infant child and pleading for intervention, for help, for anything that might prevent it. It was a desperate scheme, almost certainly doomed to fail. But it was the sole plan they possessed. Crane was informed of Marcus's disappearance just after sunrise. His reaction was explosive. He directed Overseer Grimble to organize a search party immediately, to contact the slave patrol, to dispatch riders to Charleston to monitor the roads. The plantation was in turmoil all morning as men on horseback fanned out through the adjacent swamps and fields, hunting for any trace of Marcus. They located him just past noon, about 8 miles from Marsh Bend, attempting to cross a creek. The slave patrol had dogs, and Marcus had left a trail through the soft mud near the water. They brought him back to Marsh Bend, bound with ropes, bleeding from dog bites on his arms and legs, but still alive. What transpired next became the subject of testimony in multiple legal proceedings over the ensuing months, though the accounts differed depending on who was speaking and when. Crane ordered Marcus taken to the whipping post forthwith. He announced that he would personally administer the punishment and that it would be severe enough to serve as a warning to anyone else who might contemplate running. The entire enslaved community was compelled to assemble and observe. Sarah was made to stand at the front, clutching Jacob. The punishment was brutal, even by the standards of that era and location, 50 lashes administered with a heavy leather whip. Marcus was secured to the post, his shirt torn away. Crane wielded the whip himself, putting his full strength behind each stroke. Blood appeared on Marcus's back after the 5th lash. By the 10th, his skin was torn open in multiple places. By the 20th, he had ceased screaming and hung limp against the ropes. Sarah witnessed all of it, her face like carved stone, her arms wrapped around Jacob, who was now crying, frightened by the sounds and the atmosphere of violence. Witnesses reported that Sarah's eyes never left Marcus's face, and that Marcus, in the brief moments when he was conscious, looked only at her. When it was over, Marcus was cut down and dragged to his cabin, barely conscious. Crane turned to confront the assembled crowd, his own face flushed and sweating, blood flecks on his shirt. He announced that anyone who aided a runaway, Anyone who even knew about a planned escape and failed to report it would receive the same punishment. Then he dismissed everyone back to work. Everyone except Sarah. Crane approached her, standing near enough that she had to look down at him. He was a man of average height, and beside Sarah, he appeared almost childlike, but his voice was harsh and icy. "Tomorrow morning," he stated, "Mr. Gadsden returns and he will take your son. You will not resist. You will hand the child over quietly. If you cause any trouble, if you make any scene, I will have Marcus beaten again. And this time, he will not survive it. Do you understand me?" Sarah said nothing. She merely stared down at Crane with those dark, unreadable eyes. After a protracted moment, Crane turned and strode back to the main house. That night, the plantation was unnaturally hushed. Even the customary sounds of the swamp appeared muffled, as if the world itself was holding its breath. In cabin number 7, Sarah sat on the floor, holding Jacob, rocking him slowly while he slept. In another cabin, Marcus lay on his stomach, his shredded back treated with grease and herbs by the other enslaved people, drifting in and out of consciousness. And in the main house, Josiah Crane sat in his library, examining his account books, calculating how the $400 from selling Jacob would alleviate his immediate financial strains. He drank brandy and occasionally glanced out the window toward the slave quarters, his face troubled despite his conviction that he had made the correct choice. None of them knew that the following night would conclude in bloodshed, enigma, and a legend that would never genuinely be resolved. August 14, 1827, dawned hot and oppressively humid, the quintessential low-country summer day where the atmosphere feels dense enough to choke on. The sun ascended blood-red over the rice fields, filtered through the haze of moisture rising from the swamps. Later, people would recall that detail, as if nature itself had been alerting them to what was coming. Sarah rose before daybreak, as she always did. She nursed Jacob, changed him, dressed him in the cleanest garments she possessed, a small cotton gown she had stitched herself. She clutched him tightly and whispered to him for an extended period, words no one else heard. Then she carefully positioned him in the wooden cradle Marcus had constructed, and she proceeded to work. Throughout the morning, Sarah labored in the kitchen garden with a sort of mechanical precision. The other women working nearby reported that she spoke to no one, acknowledged no one, simply moved through her tasks with her face expressionless and her movements deliberate. Several individuals attempted to address her, to offer sympathy or encouragement, but she didn't respond. It was as if she had withdrawn somewhere deep within herself, somewhere inaccessible. Around mid-morning, Nathaniel Gadsden arrived at Marsh Bend in a wagon driven by his assistant, a young man whose name isn't documented. Gadsden proceeded directly to the main house and was shown into Crane's library, where the two men finalized their transaction. $400 in cash was exchanged for ownership papers hastily prepared for an infant named Jacob, age 6 months, property of Josiah Crane, now sold to Nathaniel Gadsden. At noon, Crane sent word that Sarah should bring the child to the main house. The message was conveyed by a house servant named Ruth, who had the unfortunate task of walking to the kitchen garden and informing Sarah that it was time to surrender her son. Sarah's response was unexpected. She simply nodded. She set down her hoe, wiped her hands on her dress, and walked calmly to cabin number 7. She emerged a few minutes later carrying Jacob, who was awake and observing his surroundings with inquisitive eyes. She walked toward the main house without haste, without faltering, her face still displaying no emotion whatsoever. The other enslaved people watched her depart, many of them in tears. Some anticipated she would flee, would fight, would do something. But Sarah merely walked steadily across the yard, up the steps of the main house, and vanished inside. What transpired during the following 15 minutes comes from multiple testimonies, primarily from Ruth, who was present in the house, and from Overseer Grimble, who was summoned inside during the exchange. Sarah entered the library where Crane and Gadsden were waiting. She stood just inside the doorway, pressing Jacob against her chest. Crane gestured for her to approach. She advanced 3 steps and halted. The men anticipated her coming nearer, but she remained motionless. After an awkward pause, Crane spoke, "Sarah, give the child to Mr. Gadsden." Sarah looked at Gadsden, then at Crane. In a voice so faint they had to strain to hear, she uttered, please." It was the first time anyone at Marshbend had ever heard Sarah plead for anything. Crane's countenance hardened. "The matter is settled. Sarah, give him the child now." Sarah's arms constricted around Jacob. Her voice elevated slightly. "Please, I will work harder. I will do anything. Please do not take my child." Gadsden shifted uneasily. Crane rose from behind his desk, his voice sharp. "You forget yourself. You do not beg. You obey. Hand over the child. This instant." For an extended moment, Sarah didn't move. Then, slowly, she looked down at Jacob. She kissed his forehead. She whispered something to him. And then, with hands that were trembling for the first time anyone had ever witnessed, she extended him toward Gadsden. Gadsden stepped forward and lifted Jacob from her embrace. The infant, sensing the transition, started to cry. The sound seemed to fracture something in the room. Sarah's face crumpled, just momentarily, displaying raw anguish before she forced it back into blankness, but her hands, now empty, remained extended, as if she couldn't quite grasp that they no longer contained her son. Crane, perhaps experiencing a flicker of something akin to guilt, or perhaps merely desiring the scene to conclude, said more gently, "The child will be well cared for, Sarah. He goes to a good situation. You will work and perhaps in time you can have other children. Now go back to your work." Sarah lowered her hand slowly. She fixed her gaze on Crane with an expression that Ruth would later characterize as beyond hatred, beyond despair, something cold and conclusive. Then she pivoted and walked out of the library, out of the main house, and back toward the slave quarters. Gadsden departed Marshbend shortly after noon, with Jacob wrapped in a blanket in the wagon, crying for his mother. Sarah was observed standing near cabin number 7, watching the wagon roll down the lengthy driveway toward the main road. She remained there without stirring for nearly an hour after the wagon had vanished from sight. The afternoon passed in a peculiar, tense atmosphere. Everyone at Marshbend understood that something dreadful had occurred, but the routines of plantation life persisted regardless. The work had to be done. The rice wouldn't harvest itself. So individuals returned to the fields, to their tasks, moving mechanically through the motions while their minds were elsewhere. Sarah also returned to work. But something had shifted. Several people later testified that her movements appeared more deliberate, almost ritualistic. She labored steadily through the afternoon, declining food when it was presented, speaking to no one. As the sun commenced its descent, painting the sky in deep oranges and purples, she finally ceased working. She walked to the cabin where Marcus lay, recuperating from his beating. She entered without knocking and sat beside his pallet. Marcus was awake, his face drawn with pain, but his eyes alert. According to testimony from others in the cabin who feigned sleep but listened, Sarah and Marcus conversed in hushed tones for nearly an hour. The precise words were never recorded, but the tone was characterized as conclusive, as if they were taking leave of one another. At one juncture, Marcus extended his hand and took Sarah's in his, and they sat like that in silence for an extended period. When Sarah eventually rose to depart, Marcus articulated something that several individuals heard distinctly. "You do what you have to do." Sarah returned to cabin number 7 as full darkness descended. She didn't consume the evening meal. She sat on the floor with her back against the wall, staring at the empty cradle Marcus had built, her face illuminated by the dim light of a solitary candle. Around 9 p.m., she stood up, extinguished the candle, and exited the cabin. Several individuals observed her walking across the plantation grounds toward the main house. Her form was unmistakable, even in the darkness, towering and moving with that peculiar, quiet grace. One man, an elderly field worker named Solomon, later testified that he called out to her, inquiring where she was heading. Sarah didn't answer. She merely continued walking. At approximately 9:30 p.m., according to the clock that would later be discovered halted at that precise time in Josiah Crane's library, Sarah Drummond entered the main house through the kitchen door. The main house at Marshbend was quiet that night. Crane had dismissed most of the house servants earlier than usual, retaining only Ruth and one other servant, an older man named Isaac, who functioned as butler. Crane himself was in his library, the same room where he had taken Jacob from Sarah's arms just 9 hours earlier. He was reviewing his account books, occasionally sipping from a glass of brandy, examining the entries that now included $400 from the sale. Ruth was upstairs in one of the bedrooms, turning down the bed and preparing the room for the night. Isaac was in the kitchen building, which was separate from the main house, as was common in plantation architecture, completing the cleaning from the evening meal. Neither of them observed Sarah entering through the kitchen door and moving through the darkened house toward the library. What transpired during the subsequent several minutes has been reconstructed from physical evidence, from the testimonies of those who arrived shortly thereafter, and from one crucial witness, Ruth, who heard sounds from downstairs and came to investigate. According to Ruth's testimony, given 3 days later to the Charleston magistrate, she first heard Crane's voice, raised in anger but not quite shouting. She couldn't distinguish the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Then she detected another voice, much lower, which she instantly recognized as Sarah's. Ruth started down the stairs, moving silently, uncertain whether she should intervene. As she reached the bottom of the stairs, she overheard Crane shout, "How dare you enter this house?"